Hello, dear students. In this video, I will be talking about research in organizational behavior. So, what it is that we mean by research? Why does research matter in organizational behavior? How it has shaped our understanding of people, of people's motivations, of people's personalities, of people's behavior in the workplace context. I will provide some description about how that research is done, why it is important. Those are some of the kind of questions that I will try to cover or address in this video. So, by the end of this video, my goal is that you will have a little bit better understanding, better appreciation of the field of organizational behavior, because our field is not based on opinions. It's a scientific area of study. So the insights that you will be gaining about human behavior in workplace contexts, they come from the research that has been done in our field. Now, my expectation is not that you will become great researchers just by listening to this video or taking this class, but I'm hoping that you will become better consumers of research. You will become better consumers of anything that you read, be it in the popular medium or in this class or in your other classes. You will develop some bit of critical thinking that then you can apply anytime you are being exposed to information, to claims. In any case, with that background, let's move on to my iPad, which I will be using to illustrate the points that I want to discuss. Okay, so let me start this discussion with a very influential paper that was published in 2010. This paper was published by Dana Carney, Amy Cuddy, Andy Yap in a very prestigious journal, Psychological Science. Now, many people won't know about this article, especially those who are not researchers. But the findings in this study, they were presented by the second author of this paper, Amy Cuddy, in this highly impactful TED Talk video that was published some 13 years ago. It has 27 million views. So I think it is amongst the top 10 TED Talk videos. So it's a very impactful, inspiring video that I would, in fact, encourage all of you to watch if you haven't watched it yet. So, in this presentation that Amy Cuddy makes, Amy Cuddy, by the way, she is, or rather, she was a Harvard professor. She is not on the Harvard faculty list anymore. But in any case, she presented the findings of this study. So I will briefly explain what she presents. The figures, these that I'm sharing with you, they are all from her presentation in the TED Talk video that I was just mentioning. They are not directly from the research paper, but rather from the TED Talk video. So Amy Cuddy, she talks about different types of poses that people engage in. The top row poses that you see, they are called high power poses. So people who are in either powerful position or are feeling powerful, they tend to engage in such postures, very expansive, straight kind of postures. So these are the high power poses. Whereas these bottom row poses, these are the kind of postures that people tend to engage in when they're not feeling powerful. So they are hunched over or touching their neck, these kind of poses. These are low power poses. So what does this have to do with this study? Well, what the researchers, they were proposing was that these different poses, depending on whether you engage in high power pose or low power pose, will influence how you actually feel. So it's not that people who are feeling powerful engage only in such poses. Is it possible that when you engage in such poses, you will actually feel more powerful? And when you are engaging in such posture, which they are calling the low power poses, will you feel less powerful? So that's what they were interested to know. So what they did, they conducted some experiments. So this is an example of an experimental study, which is one of the kind of research that we do in the field of organizational behavior. So what they did, they took participants, they asked them for their saliva sample so that they can get a baseline of their testosterone levels and cortisol. So these are the two hormones. Testosterone, the higher it is, people tend to feel more powerful. Cortisol, the higher it is, the more stressed you feel. So they usually go in opposite directions. If you have high testosterone, you are going to feel less stressed. If you are feeling highly stressed, meaning if your cortisol levels are high, your testosterone levels typically tend to go down. So they collected their testosterone and cortisol level samples. And then these participants were randomly assigned to either the high power poses or the low power poses. Now, the participant did not know that these are high power poses or these are low power poses. They didn't know anything about these poses. And after that, they were asked to describe their feeling, how they were actually feeling. So they took a survey or a questionnaire for the researchers to find out whether they actually felt more powerful or less powerful. And the researchers also asked them to play a game of dice or game of luck, because people who are generally more powerful, we know from existing research, they tend to take more risks. So they were interested in finding out if the participants in the high power group, if they will take greater risks than those in the low power group. Okay, and after this game was over, they again took their saliva samples to see if there was any change in their testosterone and cortisol levels. So this is what the study was about, the procedure of the study. Hopefully you got some idea about the procedure of the study. And of course, you can read the original paper or watch Amy Curry's presentation to have greater details about the procedure. They did find that people who were engaged in high power poses, they felt more powerful, and who were engaged in low power poses, they felt less powerful. But beyond that, they found that those who were engaged in high power poses, they had greater risk tolerance. So they took much greater risks than those who were engaged in low power poses. In other words, 1 minute of you putting in certain pose that is either high or low power makes or changes your behavior. You either take more risks or less risks. And that 1 minute of these participants either engaging in high power poses or low power poses also changed their hormone levels. So from the baseline hormone, so this is 0, this is the baseline. So whatever that baseline, there was a change in their testosterone levels, testosterone change. So testosterone, it increased in those who engaged in the high power poses, and it decreased for those who engaged in the low power poses. And the opposite effect happened for cortisol, the stress hormone. So this was the baseline. Cortisol decreased, so which is a good thing, right? So you are not feeling as stressed for those who were in high power poses, and the cortisol levels, in contrast, increased for those who were engaged in low power poses. You can again watch this video to find out the implications of these changes, because you can imagine, let's say you're going for a job interview and you are feeling uncertain about how well you will be doing, you are not feeling very confident. You could consciously sit in high power poses. That can make you feel confident, and that can then make you perform better in your interview, right? Those are the kind of things. Now, that was the first part of the story. As I said, this paper had been published in 2010, right? This paper was published in 2010. With this video getting so popular, now researchers try to replicate the study, meaning with the exact same conditions, they try to repeat the study. By repeating the study, by replicating the study, are we still getting the same kind of effects that the original researchers had found? So that's what they try to do. One of the first studies was published in 2014 by Rainhill and her colleagues. And they found no effect on hormones, no increased risk tolerance for those who were engaging in high power poses. And because the first study had a very small sample size, some 40 odd people in the sample. So they did a much larger study with bigger sample size and they found no effect. Now, this was seen as an insult in a way to the original findings. So the original researchers, they made counterclaims. So there were a series of claims and counterclaims that were made in forthcoming papers. Carney, Cuddy, and Yap, the original authors of the first paper, they published this paper in 2015 as a counter to this paper, where the results of the original study could not be replicated. So in that review of 23 studies, they said that, well, many of these studies do show effect. Even if this particular study did not replicate their findings, there are other studies that do replicate the findings of this study. And we have analyzed 33 studies, so we stick to our claim that these poses, they impact not only how we feel, but also how we behave, and they make a real physiological change in our hormone levels. That's the claim that they had reiterated in this 2015 study. Now, Simons and Simonson did a thorough analysis of those 33 papers that Carney, Cuddy, and Yap had referred to in their study. This statistical analysis will be a little difficult to explain in this basic video, but I will try to summarize those findings as simply as possible through this graph that we see in Simmons and Simonson's paper. Now, before I describe the graph, I don't know if you know, but hopefully in your stats classes, if you remember, there is something called the p-value. P-value. Oops. Now, p-value is used to determine the significance of statistical tests of any particular findings. So when the p-value is less than 0.05, what we are saying is that there is less than 5% chances that the study findings are, or any particular finding in this study where the p-value is less than 0.05, we are saying that there is a less than 5% chance that this is a finding that happened just as a matter of chance. Okay, so we have, in other words, 95% confidence that this was a real finding and not just some finding that happened as a matter of chance. But we can have stronger standards as well, like it could be less than 0.01, which is only 1 in 100 chance that this finding was just a matter of chance. So 99% confidence that this was a real finding. That kind of inference is usually made with respect to p-values. So in scientific studies, at least 0.05, that is the standard that is set. If you aren't even meeting that standard, then the results are considered non-significant. They are considered just results that probably happened as a matter of chance, and they are not really changes in your testosterone levels and cortisol levels. So if and only if the p-values are less than or equal to 0.05, are we going to say that these results are real results, real effects, and not something that was observed as a matter of fluke. Now, for instance, testosterone levels, they do change, they do fluctuate. So how much of that changes that we are observing is that really the effect of this power poses and not just the kind of fluke changes that are constantly happening in our body. Now, this is what researchers sometimes mess things on. When they get results that is slightly above zero point zero 0.05, let's say 0.06 or 0.052. So it is more than 0.05 as opposed to being less than 0.05. So this will be discarded as non-significant. If you find such results, they will be discarded. You actually will not be able to publish such papers often because the effects that you observed in your study, they just happened as a matter of chance, is what is argued. We do not have enough confidence that they were real effects. But what if you have such p-values? Then researchers sometimes try to engage in a lot of acrobatics, try to increase some control variables, or try to do certain other statistical manipulations. Not necessarily unethical manipulations, but manipulations that can still reduce these p-values below 0.05. They may remove some of the observations or whatever. So they then artificially push the p-values below 0.05. So with that background, now what do we see here? What do we see in Simon and Simonson's paper? What they find is something really interesting. Now, this graph that you see, this dotted line that you see here, that is how the distribution of the p-values would have been if there was no effect across these 33 studies. So that is how the distribution would have been if there was no effect. This green dash line that you see, that is how the distribution would have been if there was really effect, the kind of effect that we are talking about here. Of course, you see these lines are very different. So what's the difference between this green line and this dotted line? The green line, you see, there is greater percentage of studies which have p-value closer to 0.01. That means we have greater confidence. So more studies have p-values close to or lower than 0.01. Fewer studies have p-values close to or around 0.05, slightly less. But this blue line that you see, this is what was actually observed in these 33 studies. So 25% of the studies had p-values of very close to 0.05. So as you go like this, the average ultimately comes down to this, right? In other words, there were a pretty large number of studies that had p-values between 0.03 and 0.05, and very few studies that had these really low p-values or high confidence, high statistical confidence kind of papers, based on which they concluded that, well, this effect that had received so much of attention and so much of popularity actually turns out to be not a real effect at all. Effects may have been genuine, but only in this one fluke study. On repetition of these studies, what we find is that there is essentially no effect or null effect, right? But to be fair, they did find effects on the feelings. So when people do engage in high power poses, they do feel a little powerful. There was some effect on feelings. I didn't go into that much of detail in these replication studies, but there was no effect on behavior and no effect on changes in hormone levels. So not as interesting and exciting as what had been initially claimed in this paper and especially in this TED Talk. Now, why am I talking about all these papers and this history of how research on this particular domain developed over the years and how our notions about power posing and their effects changed just within a decade based on these different studies and their findings? Okay, so This example should give you an idea of experimental studies. In experimental studies, we try to control everything. We control everything as much as possible. We try to keep everything same. We just manipulate a few things and see the effects of those manipulations. These manipulations, they tend to be called independent variable, their effects on the dependent variable. In this case, risk-taking behavior and hormone changes. That's experimental study. When we are doing surveys, we aren't manipulating things. We are just collecting a lot of information about lot of variables. I may include, let's say, personality survey. I may include how satisfied you are in your life. I may include how satisfied you are in your life and in your job satisfaction. I may send out a survey where I have several items that measures your personality, several items that measure your life satisfaction, several items that measure your job satisfaction. Now, later on, I then can do a statistical analysis of how people of certain personality traits, let's say people who are highly conscientious, that's a personality trait, they may report higher life satisfaction than people who are, so this is high conscientiousness, and then low conscientiousness. They may report low life satisfaction. Okay, we may find similar kind of pattern, let's say, for job satisfaction as well. Whereas for another personality variable, let's say neuroticism, people who are high on neuroticism versus people who are low on neuroticism. Maybe we may find the opposite pattern. People who are high on neuroticism may report lower levels of job satisfaction, whereas people who are low on the neuroticism dimension, they may report higher levels of job satisfaction. You understand the point? So this will be an example of a survey. Here we are just adding various survey items and surveying or asking participants to fill in those survey. And then we are doing statistical analysis to find patterns in the responses. But the problem with surveys is that a whole host of other factors that are not within the control of the researcher could be influencing these patterns. So it is possible on the day that this survey was given, for example, in one of the plants where the survey was given, that particular plant or that particular project had high performing individuals. So they also reported high job satisfaction. Whereas on the day that another group of people were surveyed, they were working on projects that were not considered successful, not considered very exciting. So it was not necessarily the personality traits that is actually influencing the job satisfaction, but the different kind of projects that people are working on. But we cannot find out what the real reason is for these differing patterns of job satisfaction because we did not control for those factors. So in our discipline, we conduct many kinds of studies. We conduct surveys, we conduct experiments. We also do what are called meta-analytic studies, which are advanced statistical tools that does analysis of many studies that have been done until a particular point of time to find out what the overall pattern is. Any individual study, howsoever exciting it may be, as we saw in these studies, may turn out to be results that are actually not true. We find whether those results are genuinely real results or not when we do such meta-analytic studies that compile the results from many other studies and give us an idea about what is actually happening across many studies. So any single study may show big effects or small effects. When we are talking about evidence, we are talking about evidence across many studies. What is the pattern? For instance, in a completely different domain, you will see many studies that say, drinking wine is good for your health. We'll also see studies that will say that alcohol is bad for you. But studies like these, like meta-analytic studies, does the analysis of all the studies that have been done on the consumption of alcohol on health, on longevity, on different diseases. That's when we find the real effect of alcohol consumption and its effect on different diseases, longevity, and so on and so forth, which it turns out is really negative. So even if there are individual studies that may show that, hey, alcohol consumption is actually good for you, especially when you drink in moderation, but no, that turns out to be not really the case when we do such meta-analytic studies, which is an analysis, a real thorough, rigorous statistical analysis of studies, several studies that have been done on the subject. Then we find the real pattern, real results. Because any individual study may be sponsored by different kind of companies that have vested interests in promoting a particular result. But when we analyze the results from the several labs across the world, and when we try to see the effects, then we get an idea of the real kind of effects that is happening. So this hopefully gives you some good understanding of the kind of studies that we do in our field. But these studies that I talked about, experimental study, surveys, and meta-analytic studies, they are all quantitative studies, right? Quantitative studies means the data that we collect in these studies, they can be converted into numbers, and then we analyze those numbers using different statistical methods. But in our field, we also conduct what are called qualitative studies. Qualitative studies. And there are many kinds of qualitative studies. It could be observation studies, it could be interviews. But some of the common forms are like interviews, where the researcher may go and interview experts or interview employees working in an organization to find out how happy or unhappy they are, how motivated or not very motivated they are. So those kind of studies are called qualitative studies. We do not collect quantitative data, which is something that can be done in experiments and surveys. But we are collecting qualitative data, meaning data that is in textual format and not in form of numbers. And then you do an analysis of what these participants said in their interview and make your conclusions. But generally, the gold standard when it comes to studies are experimental studies to find out causal effect. Is it that power poses really have an effect on behaviors and hormone changes? That's the kind of effect we succeed in finding in experimental studies. But we do not rely on any single study, be they experimental or survey. We finally then go for meta-analytic studies. Meta-analytic studies to find the overall pattern across the population. That should be giving you enough insights about the kind of research that we do in our field and the kind of implications they actually have on our understanding of how people behave in organizations. Thank you.